back to Troubleshooting Agile. Hi there, Jeffrey.
Hi, Squirrel. Squirrel, I've got a question for you.
Great, I'd love to answer questions. That's my favorite thing.
Okay, so now you might remember that the podcast we have here started many years ago. I think maybe 2017 or something like that. 2017, 2018, I don't remember exactly. Well, anyway, so we started because we were working on a book together, and we had a different title for the book.
Jeffrey, I'm going to step in
Then
there and
we,
stop you for a second. Hang on, Jeffrey, hang on.
oh yeah, yeah.
None of the words you've said have been the start of a question. That would be things like what and how and why. I didn't hear any of that. What's your question?
Oh, oh yeah. Um, my question is, how do you deal with it when you have clients who tell you long stories and don't actually get around to asking their question?
Well, you were giving a beautiful example of that, Jeffrey, so thank you for that. And what I do is I train them, and I train them to ask me the question first. And when I first started this, I was inspired by Alan Weiss, who's a great consultant, and he does this, and it seems to work very well for him. So I just did it because he did. And I found two things very rapidly. First, I found that often I could answer the question without any of the context. So, for example, I could answer your question, Jeffrey, without needing to hear about the start of the podcast and whatever was inspiring you to come up with it and come to this question. I know the answer to the question, how do I deal with that? I can answer. And it's often true that someone will, once they figure out what their question is, be able to ask me a question like, what should I do about this really annoying person? And I can say, go talk to them. This allows me to be a very efficient consultant. Now, there's another purpose, though, which people often miss, and I missed for a long time. And that is that it actually helps the person as well to get out of that kind of fog, because our listeners probably experienced this. They were, what are we talking about? Why are we talking about the start of the podcast? Where's Jeffrey going? We were kind of confused. And Jeffrey, I imagine you might have felt some of that fog as you were starting on this sort of vague journey to we're not sure where. But instead, you can clear the fog and say, well, actually, the problem is this guy's a jerk. What am I going to do about this jerk on my team? And when you can get that level of clarity and you can get to a question, it helps you a lot. And I find that people are less dependent on me because they are able to pose a question and answer it themselves. Now, how about you, Jeffrey? What do you do about folks who waffle on?
Well, I was going to say first, my experience is very similar, and I think you used a key word there about kind of the fog. Um, in what I often have happen is people come to me and they have a sense of a problem, and it's been bothering them, and they've been thinking about it a lot, but they haven't sort of taken that and sharpened it to the point of having a question. And I think this is what explains a little bit about why, when they will come and describe a situation, it starts with a lot of preamble, a lot of context loading, because this is kind of the amorphous stuff that they have in their mind that maybe, hasn't been distilled into a story yet. It's just been sort of, rolling around in their mind all this time. And my experience is much like yours, which is I typically will let them go. I'm maybe a little bit less efficient as a
You're
consultant
more
compared to
patient.
you.
I'm impatient. Go ahead.
But we'll often get to the point where they finish explaining the situation, and they actually don't have a question. They finish by describing the scenario, and they say something like, "Well, and that's what's going on." And then I will often in the coaching say, "Well, and so what exactly do you see as the problem, or what do you see as the question?" And to try to sharpen what the inquiry is. And what I find is a couple of things. One is uh, when they go around to actually making that the point or the problem, they often then will follow up by saying, "Oh, I guess now that I say that, now that I'm explicit about the problem, I think I know what I need to do next." Like they get to the answer, and what's prevented them getting the answer is that they never were very explicit about exactly what they thought the problems were or exactly what they thought the question was. The second thing that
Jeffrey,
happens.
do you ever give them a rubber duck at that point?
Well, the rubber duck, so the rubber duck is the idea that someone says explain the problem to the duck first. I think that the rubber duck wouldn't necessarily help them here because they don't realize that they don't have a question. until I ask. And I know you and I have both talked about how after we've coached someone for a while, they'll say something like, "Well, you know, I was doing something last week, and this thing came up, and then I heard the voice of Jeff in my head, or I heard the squirrel in my head," right?
Yep.
And a lot of times, I think that that voice is saying is, "Well, what exactly is the problem?" And then what is the any of the number of things that we might say. What's the next thing you can try? What's the next experiment? That kind of thing. And I
We
think
need a rubber
until
Jeffrey who's like those Barbie dolls that if you push the button, it says one of 10 canned phrases.
exactly right, yeah. So I do think sometimes my consulting work does get sort of distilled down into, the magic, of course, is knowing which of the 10 phrases, and maybe having people had enough experience that those things become useful. But that is definitely the case. The other thing that happens, I'll say, because you mentioned it's better for you if they do it first, in part because you can answer directly. But the other thing I'll say is a lot of times, even if it's not necessarily I'm going to answer things directly, but when I understand what the question is, if they then provide me the context afterwards, I can pick up on which pieces are relevant. In other words, the question provides the framing so that as the story comes up, I know which are going to be relevant pieces, relevant clues, and start putting together theories. Whereas on the first pass through, when I'm sort of hearing the story of all the context and this thing started a couple months ago and we've had this thing, we tried these different things. If I lack the hook of exactly what the perceived problem is, then I don't know which of the details to be paying attention to. Um,
And that's probably what our listeners were hearing and feeling when you started with your vague question at the beginning here, because they were saying, "What's this about? It's supposed to be about questions, but wait a minute, where's Jeffrey going?"
yeah,
Whereas
that's right.
if you had said first, "I'm going to ask you, Squirrel, a question about how you get people to ask you the question first," they could have been listening for that in the history of our podcast and how we interact together, or whatever it was that brought you to that topic. So listeners might have experienced that here.
Right. That's right. And there's a principle that comes up in many times, which is begin with the end in mind. I think this is from Seven Habits of Highly Effective People. Um, and in a sense, the ask the question first is a bit like that principle. If you are aware of what the question is, what the problem is, what the dilemma is, what the options are before you get into the context, then it's much more it's much easier to navigate the story and context and prompt and for relevant details as they come up. So I think there's this larger principle of beginning with the end in mind, of which starting with the question first is very much the case. The case that you particularly experience, the sort of degenerate case where the question is actually sufficient standalone and the context isn't necessary, that definitely happens. To me, it's a bit more interesting that even the cases where that's not true, having the question first still makes the conversation more efficient and more effective.
Absolutely, because one of the things I often do when someone asks me a question that does have an assumption in it or does have some piece of context that is missing for me, I do ask about that. So, Jeffrey, if you were to ask me, Squirrel, should I go skiing this weekend? I might say, where are you planning to go skiing? If you're planning to go in Argentina, my answer will be very different from if you're planning to go in, I don't know, Finland. And I can ask you that, but once I know you're asking about skiing, then I can give you a much better and more meaningful answer. Actually, I could also just tell you I don't know because I don't know anything about skiing. But I could give you a meaningful answer and ask for the context I need, rather than hearing about all your travel plans and why you're going and how there's a big conference in Helsinki that we all want people to go to and everything else. So the focus comes from the question, whether or not I'm able to answer it immediately.
Yes, yeah, that's right. And again, I think this is something here that's generalizable because while we're describing this in a coaching context, this is something that is our listeners can apply not just in one-on-one conversations, but this is often a very important improvement in meetings. If you have group discussions, it can be very common there for people to kind of start their story and get around to the question at the end. And now rather than having just one coach suffering from not understanding where this is going, you have a whole room full of people who are not clear where it's going. So this idea of providing the question first before providing the context is valuable, not just in one-on-ones, but in your group discussions as well.
Absolutely. And when you're designing a product, whether it's a software product or any other kind, one of the things you do is, of course, go talk to users, and they want to tell you their life history too. It's great to hear that, and generally, product managers in our audience will know it's really useful to understand your personas and their problems and their needs outside your product and where it fits. But it sure also helps if you want to figure out what to actually do, if you know where they're going. So if they could start with, I'd really like a report that runs every day. And then they could tell you the history of all the reports they've ever had and why they all suck. But if you have that frame for the product, then you can be thinking all the time about how am I going to make a great report that works better for them.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So definitely the case of the context helping, and a more efficient thing. I think this is one of those kind of generic tools for thought. I often tell my clients that, in my experience, clear language helps for clear thought. And being clear on exactly what the question is or exactly what the problem is one of those general enhancements for conversation and thinking.
Fantastic. Well, if listeners are finding that they have difficulty with clear language and asking a question first, or maybe they are one of these people who really likes to tell the story first and they find it really valuable, and they disagree with us, that would be really interesting too. We'd love to hear from you wherever you stand on this topic. The mailbag is always full of interesting topics for us, and we can never get to as many of them as we want to. So fill up our mailbag with questions, or not, whichever way you'd like. And the way to get to that mailbag is to go to agileconversations.com, where you will find our book and information on conversational dojos and free videos and all kinds of other cool free stuff. And of course, you'll also find our email and whatever crazy bot-based thing somebody has thought up that seems to be changing all the time. So lots of different ways to get in touch with us, and they all work, and we'd sure love to hear from you there. Of course, the other way to keep in touch is to come back again next week when we'll have another edition of Troubleshooting Agile. Thanks, Jeffrey.
Thanks, Squirrel.